Good evening, everyone. My name is Erica Addams, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Justice Studies at San Jose State University, and I will be your moderator for this event. Welcome to the panel entitled Black Lives Matter versus Far-Right Extremism, Protests, Movements, and Riots. So this event is co-sponsored by the Division on People of Color and Crime of the American Society of Criminology and the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So thank you so much for all the members of the audience who joined us today. We are truly honored to have an amazing panel of scholars and community activists here today for this discussion. And we have 4 panelists. The first panelist is Janae Bonsu, and Janae is an activist, scholar, and organizer. Janae is a PhD candidate at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's also a member of Black Youth Project 100, and she currently leads the She Safe, We Safe campaign. Janae is also on the board of directors of MRelief and the Action Center on Race and the Economy. Thank you so much for being with us today, Janae.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sorry. I think something just got caught in my throat. Okay, our second panelist is Dr. Matthew Clare. Dr. Clare, I'm really sorry, guys, one second. Okay, so I'm back, and this is being recorded, so hopefully we can just do a little snippet and snip that part out.
It'll be fine.
Okay. Okay, so our second panelist is Dr. Matthew Clare, and Dr. Clare is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, and by courtesy, the law school at Stanford University. He is the author of the book, Privilege and Punishment, How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Courts. Dr. Clare's research interests include law and society, race and ethnicity, social inequality, cultural sociology, criminal justice, and qualitative research methods. Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Clare.
Thanks for having me.
Our third panelist is Dr. Jennifer Kubina. Dr. Kubina is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Dr. Kubina is the author of the book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. Much of Dr. Kubina's work has had an impact on criminal justice policy. She recently joined the CNA Project on American Justice and will work with a team of elite leaders to provide actionable advice and explore creative solutions to improve current issues facing law enforcement around the country. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Kubina.
Glad to be here, thank you.
And our fourth panelist is Selu Skylark, and Selu is a Brooklyn-based activist and community organizer, and we are so happy that you could join us today, Selu.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the panel today is sort of broken up into 2 segments. The first segment will be approximately a 45-minute moderated discussion with our panelists. During the second segment, we'll be able to take questions from the audience, and the panel is being recorded, so please just be mindful of that. Anytime you have questions during the first segment or the second segment, you could put it in the chat function and we will get to those questions in the second segment of the event. Okay, so for our fourth panelist, and you can answer these questions in any order, whichever one of you want to jump in first. So the first question to the panelists would be, could you please tell us about how you first became involved in activist work and how you would convey the importance of the work that you do?
I'm happy to kick us off. So again, I'm Janae Bonsu, and I'd say that I got my first taste of activism on MLK Day 21 years ago, actually. My mom told me that we were gonna honor MLK's legacy that day by taking a stand for something important. And I didn't know exactly what we were walking into. I'm 8 or 9 years old at this time, but I did know that we lived in Columbia, South Carolina, where ironically I found myself in now, in present day. I moved back, but I'd already heard the N word on the playground, being called that by white boys before. I had already felt white supremacy at that young age. And so I was happy to tag along for whatever was going down. And so we got to downtown Columbia, and honestly, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were thousands upon thousands of people stretched for blocks chanting, "Take it down, take it down." And I'm like, what is going on? I saw people holding signs with different slogans like, "Your heritage is my slavery." And I just started to slowly begin to piece together what was happening. This huge crowd of what I now know to be upwards of 50,000 mostly Black people were marching to the South Carolina State House, where the Confederate battle flag blew in the wind for as long as anyone could remember. Fun fact that South Carolina was the only state in what used to be the Confederacy that still flew that battle flag. And that year people had enough. And so it's kind of ironic that today we're talking about white supremacy and rebellion, because and thinking back to my kind of beginnings in activism, because for Black people, especially in the South, the Confederate flag was a symbol of white supremacy and racism, a memorabilia of slavery. And so on MLK Day that day, I joined the largest civil rights protest in South Carolina's history. I was an 8-year-old who had never attended a protest before, and I was really feeling it. I was screaming the chants at the top of my lungs. I was pumping my little fist. It was really energizing. And I didn't have the language at that time to describe all that I was marching against, but I knew it felt like I was on the right side of history that day. And, I felt overwhelmed in a really good way because, I'd never seen that many Black folks in particular in one place, united in a common goal. So it was a really transformative experience for me that helped solidify my commitment to make the world a better place than I found it. But after the march, I didn't really know how to do that. Once my mom and I left, I had no idea what the next steps were. After we, does that mean that they were just going to take the flag down because we, yelled loud and, so the high of the moment slowly but surely dissipated for me. But the problems and the issues that I grew acutely aware of didn't. So, outside of doing my part by, volunteering and, doing community service work in the years that followed, I was really stumped as to what to do for long-term change. And so my journey to figuring out my role in building the world I want to live in led me to a master's program in social work in Chicago in 2013. And shortly thereafter, I joined an organization called BYP 100. Or Black Youth Project 100, that had the mission to create justice and freedom for all Black people. And so me finding a political home later helped me understand why I was ultimately disappointed in the aftermath of that MLK protest so many years before. It was because I was mobilized that day in that moment, but I was not organized. And so to me, therein lies the difference between activism and organizing, with activism just being a really accessible entry point for people to join movements. Anyone can be an activist. Anyone can and should be an activist, to take action on behalf of things we care about. Activists attend rallies, they make phone calls, they write letters, they speak out against injustice. I think for me as an organizer, you understand that power lies in the people and the relationships you build and long-term strategy. And so, my involvement in the movement for Black Lives as an organizer has also, shaped my approach to research or, academic scholarship. And just to conclude, I think in terms of importance for me, is having a vehicle to drive my values home was a feeling of purpose. And so something that Alice Walker said that's always stuck with me is, activism is the rent for living on this planet. So, to pay up, I think it just starts with asking yourself, what are your values? And where are they misaligned or even absent in your life? And where do you have some degree of control to do something about it? And so those are the questions I kind of grapple with every day to drive what I do.
Would anyone like to go next?
I can hop on. My name's Selu. The moment that I got into activism, I believe I was 17, and it was a Black Lives Matter protest for Trayvon Martin. It was my first year in college, and I had always grown up with like the narratives of being a Black activist and protesting for your life and Black history and all of that, because I came from a very vocal household. So when the moment presented itself to me when I was 17, I kind of just like jumped into it. I believe that night that I joined, we ended up doing a die-in in the middle of like a very large intersection. And that was the moment that kind of kicked off my inner fire, where I was just like, this is something that I want to continue to do for the rest of my life, because it is important to me. But I really like what Janae had said. That moment was when I was mobilized, not organized, because later on, as I grew older, I started getting involved in local politics in my town in Richmond, Virginia. That's where I started. And when I moved to New York is when I actually started like getting more involved in larger communities and seeking out organizations and trying to figure out like how to do it in a more organized and concise way to bring about more change versus just being kind of like a little kid when I was 17, just being like, well, I think I'm making a difference, but I wanted to like know how to do it on a larger scale. And I think, yeah, that was the moment where I realized that it was my calling. And I think that the thing that's important to me with activism and organizing is nothing comes out of being complacent within societies. Everything comes out of social justice movements, people on the ground and people pushing for social change, because if we don't demand it and fight for it, then it won't happen. And that's why I want to continue doing what I'm doing.
I can go next. So my journey is a bit different from Janae and Selu. So I first got involved in activist work pretty late when I went to, following Michael Brown's death, I went to Ferguson to conduct interviews with protesters. And I had attended this, the National Day of Protest Against Police Brutality. Me and several criminologists and sociologists, we formed this group, the Ferguson Research Action Collaborative. And we went because we wanted to contribute to the struggle for racial justice. And since then I've attended a few protests, but I have gotten more so involved in terms of, for example, I volunteer with the Grassroots Law Project, where they bridge the gap between grassroots organizing and legal expertise within the criminal legal system to address failures within the criminal legal system. And the goal is not only to address failures within the criminal legal system, but also to hold powerful actors accountable and advocate for deep structural change. So through the Grassroots Law Project, I've received like training to host and lead like a defund the police meeting with local elected officials. And thousands of people across the nation have been part of this and received webinar trainings to host and lead meetings with their own local elected officials. Since city and county officials generally have the power to cut police budgets, and local officials are easier to overwhelm rather than state and federal officials. I've joined the Campaign Zero, which is a comprehensive platform of research-based policy solutions to end police violence in America. And I've also been part of the Black Lives Matter Lansing chapter. And in addition, for me, I have now, in terms of my academic work, I've written quite a few op-eds and blogs to also spotlight some of the devastating impact of police brutality and mass incarceration, particularly on Black and Brown people. And for me, it's important to highlight these inequities and also advocate for structural change. So that's a little bit of my journey.
So thanks again for having us be in this conversation. I'm so excited to learn from all of you, and I've already learned so much about you as individuals and your activism. Like Janae, I grew up attending sort of a march in Nashville is where I grew up, every MLK holiday with our church. But really my activism sort of emerged and sort of my scholarship is birthed really in activism. So I started graduate school in 2012. And that was the year, of course, Trayvon Martin was killed, like Silu was mentioning. And for me, that was also a motivating moment. In 2013, that summer, after George Zimmerman was not convicted of killing Trayvon Martin, I went to a protest in Roxbury, and with hundreds of other people, we were frustrated. We were trying to figure out how in the world could our legal system be one that, and people have known this for a long time, but I think Trayvon Martin's killing was a clear indication of it. A legal system could let a man kill a boy out of nothing more than anti-Black fear, but then is constantly pulling in boys like him and young men and women, Black and Indigenous folks, for far less routinely, and punishing them far worse. And so that really sort of shifted my trajectory as an academic. I was only a year into grad school. I thought I was going in to maybe study educational inequality and race with respect to education, having been a third grade teacher. But then I ultimately decided that this was the struggle that I wanted to understand and unpack more. And really for me, I think being a scholar and an activist, these things are perfectly aligned. I think that being a scholar and an activist, being on the ground and talking to people on the ground, people who are engaged in organizing on the ground, really has increasingly given me much better insight, not just into inequality, right? So I think scholars often talk about inequality and injustice. What explains it? How can we figure out, its sort of causal mechanisms? But I also think that it's really important to then move to how do we fix it? And scholars have not, at least sociologists historically and criminologists historically, have not been the best at sort of focusing on solutions to the problems that we meticulously and beautifully identify. And I think we need some beautiful engagement and with people who are on the ground and strategizing possible ways of making these harms no longer part of the way our society operates. So that's really what excites me about the interface between scholarship and activism, is learning from people on the ground and then helping to scale it up and helping to sort of, as Jennifer was saying, get the word out, share the resources and strategizing that's happening on the ground, and help to legitimate it through my position as an academic.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your experiences with how you became involved in organizing and thinking about creating social change. It really helped us to see how you got delved into this work when you spoke about the events that sort of sparked your entry. My second question for you sort of thinks about what we saw last summer and what we saw more recently. So last summer, we saw that protests erupted in response to police killing George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless other unarmed Black men, women, and children. And if we think about the modern history of policing, it is a history that we see is violence, where excessive force is used against communities of color. last summer, when the Black Lives Matter movement protested to end police brutality, the movement was met with support from people across the country, but also some criticism, right? The movement was criticized because of the protesting tactics that were implemented, or it was said to be divisive. And protesters were also called looters. Now, fast forward to January 6th, when we had the Capitol riot or Capitol insurrection this year. Now, some people are starting to draw some equivalence between the Black Lives Matter protests and the Capitol riot, and saying that, well, both groups are protesting for justice or a sense of unfairness in the system. How would you respond to this perceived equivalency?
Okay. I'll start by saying I think it's a false equivalency, to be sure. It makes me think about this, I think, famous Frederick Douglass quote where he says, "The only thing worse than a rebellion is the reason for it." And so, I think the reasons or purposes and the people on the two ends of this comparison make all the difference in the world to me. In her book, Unapologetic, an old friend of mine, Charlene Carruthers, wrote about how white supremacists organized in the run-up to the 2016 US presidential election by weaving a story of oppression fraught with lies. And, it's amazing to me the ways that history repeats itself so often. In any case, I once thought that all organizers were progressive people fighting the good fight. But no, some people organize to restrict access to human dignity for others. Some people organize to dominate and oppress others. And, they believe, really believe that their anti-Black, xenophobic, patriarchal ideas enough to organize people and resources around that vision of a world where white men rule. And so when a figurehead like the 45th president of the United States, who believes in and has been trying to sustain such a world, fans the flames of hate with misinformation about a stolen election, that leads to what we saw in the Capitol siege, right? And so I can't really fathom the comparison to uprisings against generational racial injustice and state violence. That siege last month was an attempt at a coup to preserve white nationalist empire, whereas BLM protests were efforts to see it fall. So yeah, I think they're really diametrically opposed to me.
I mean, I would also agree with what Janae has just said. The two, they're fundamentally different. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations were based on not only a truth, but a visible truth, which entailed standing up for basic rights. And those basic rights included ending systemic racism and also encouraging fairness in the application of the rule of law. So the attack on the Capitol was based on a lie and on conspiracies that the election was stolen. And so this was what we saw was a direct attack on a democratic institution with the goal of trying to overturn a fair and free election. So it was really an attempt to stop this whole process of democracy. So that's one difference. The second is that the Capitol riot really showed a group of people who were demonstrating raw power, while the Black Lives Matter protesters essentially are asking for power, right? In these two different cases, you have people without power who are trying to seek equality for everyone, particularly marginalized individuals. In contrast with the Capitol riot, we saw that those who already have the power are doing everything they can to suppress any political opinion that differs from their own opinions. And the third thing I would say in terms of how it differs is that the insurrection also, it differs in its intent because, the insurrectionists acted as if they knew they wouldn't be punished, right? So in the act of storming the Capitol, the insurrectionists did not fear any adverse consequences, right? They were not afraid to be known. And so we all saw that because, they posted videos of themselves and selfies on social media. They boasted about what they were doing. We saw one had posed for a photograph with his feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk. Others gave interviews narrating, their exploits. And so what we all witnessed was white impunity was on display during this attempted coup. And in contrast, the Black Lives Matter protesters were met, we all know they were met with tear gas and rubber bullets and other repressive police tactics as they were marching for Black lives. And, also in addition, to kind of piggyback off of what Janae was just saying, those who stormed the Capitol, they were emboldened because of this culture of impunity of the Trump era, right? So this is a moment when ultimately what we see is that bad behavior goes unpunished. And, Trump had told his supporters that loyalty to his cause ultimately trumps fidelity to the law. And he reinforced this message because we all saw him handing out pardons to aides who got in trouble because they put him ahead of the law. And so, the crowd that he ultimately summoned to the Capitol ultimately took that message to heart. So there are several differences, fundamental differences between the Black Lives Matters protests and the Capitol riots.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Janae and Jennifer are saying. I don't think on any planet you can equivalate the two movements. I wouldn't even call the Capitol riot an actual movement. It was a blatant display of domestic terrorism by white supremacists. But I think the largest difference, and it echoes what Jennifer and Janae had said, the Capitol riots was a fight to maintain white supremacy. It was a fight to maintain power. And Black Lives Matter is a fight for justice. It is a fight for lives. It is a fight for rights. It is a fight for equality. I think what a lot of white people in American society, what they tend to do, especially when the 45th president was in power, they kind of used him as a symbol for white supremacy. And so he could be like the token to take all the blame for what is racist in America instead of identifying what is racist in America. And the Capitol riots was a very blatant expression of like what was hidden in the fabric of this society. It's just that they saw him and they were like, well, now is our chance to fight back and like regain some type of power, because if we lose this, then we lose our America. That's how I felt when I saw it happening, because as someone who has been protesting throughout the summer and in various different and dangerous situations, I was met with force. I was met with cop cars trying to run me over. There was tear gas, there was batons and everything. And the simplest thing that we were doing was just walking through the streets saying that our lives matter. And then white supremacists go to the Capitol saying that they are losing their country. And and I see the Capitol Police being like, well, I'm not necessarily going to fight back because I also believe I'm losing my country. Because the people that were storming the Capitol were the people that were also protecting the Capitol at that point, because that is what this country is based on. And that is what we're founded on. And so it really just looked like a whole mess of white supremacy just not knowing how to handle themselves at that point. And what happened afterwards also shows how white America feels about it, where there were folks who were arrested and then they were put in prison, and then they were getting organic meals and everything upon request, versus people who have been imprisoned, Black people who have been imprisoned, who are Muslim and whatnot, and they are not given that same right, where they're being fed pork or like spoiled food and things like that. So it just shows like how this country like views preserving itself versus admitting to its faults.
I have very little to add, so I'll be very, very brief. I think you all, hit the nail on the head. I just want to underscore the democratic nature of BLM organizing and protesting against, of course, the Capitol rioters upholding an unjust system of white supremacy. The other thing, though, that I did want to mention too, I think, in this comparison, often sort of the phrase or idea of violence and sort of the metaphors for it, I think are quite different. And so like the violence that we saw, it was very minor in BLM protests and may not have even been organizers who were part of the movement who were intended to protest for democratic inclusion. But even that, like the memes and the images and the metaphors for what violence constituted with respect to the BLM protests versus what violence constituted with respect to the insurrection were wildly different. And I wouldn't even characterize what has been called violence among the media and some elected officials for BLM as violence. It was really it was targeted at buildings or stores, and it was an intentional effort really to sort of critique systems of power that have historically oppressed marginalized people and continue to do so today. And really, the looting of stores or taking from stores can really be seen as a form of or critique really of economic injustice. Whereas, of course, with the Capitol riots, what we see there is true violence. That's harm against other people with the intentional effort of killing people. That was not at all part of BLM protesting. And so I think even sort of when people talk about, oh, but there was some violence in each of these, that also cannot be made to be equivalent.
Thank you so much. And so to continue this line of thinking about violence, I'd like to talk about the response from the police to Black Lives Matter protesters last summer as compared to what we saw with the Capitol insurrection. If we think about Portland, we could think about all the tear gas that protesters in the Black Lives Matter protest experience. We could think about people who were arrested, people who were beaten, people, guns that were pulled on protesters. There was a real heavy presence and forceful policing tactics that were used against the Black Lives Matter protesters. And in contrast, we saw with the Capitol insurrection, a lot of the people who were in the Capitol, they were escorted out of the building, they were allowed to leave. And so my next question to the panel would be, why was there such a stark difference between the policing strategies implemented against Black Lives Matter protesters as compared to the ones that we saw at the Capitol insurrection?
I guess I did.
Y'all know the answer to that.
Okay.
I just brief. I'm sure you all will echo and build, but I'll just say briefly that I believe that Black bodies are often seen as threats, and that's not just my belief. I mean, studies support this, and not just the Black bodies themselves, but also, again, going back to the purpose. The purpose behind these protests are threats to the status quo. So I think. I see policing strategies in response to the BLM movement as a direct response to a threat to status quo and the threat of the people themselves. I mean, every direct action or protest that I've been a part of, I have anticipated the possibility of being harmed or arrested. I mean, I remember being a part of a civil disobedience action at the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, or IACP conference in Chicago back in 2015. I was participating on a level where, we anticipated that arrest would happen, right? But I went into it with a legitimate, grounded fear that I could very well possibly die doing this. And nothing in me believes that any person involved in that riot at the Capitol had a fear of death. Why would they, when the US police forces have repeatedly signaled their support for Trump and vice versa throughout his presidency? And so, I think Capitol Police were complicit in the coup attempt. and that's not just in isolation. I mean, we can go and think about, Dylan Roof, who massacred 9 people in a Black church and was, just politely escorted. And, I think they even stopped at a Burger King or something, something crazy wild that I read, just about how this like mass murderer, is treated versus, people who are literally just like trying to put their bodies on the line for full humanity and to be able to live in their full dignity in this world. So yeah, I just believe that it kind of boils down to the bodies themselves and the status quo that they're trying to change.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think that violence towards Black people has been so ingrained and rationalized into American society throughout history that it's just become the norm, to the point where if there is a death that they deem like society should care about, they have to rationalize in a way where like, oh, look, this person was a father, they didn't deserve it. That's like a narrative that I cannot stand, and that I have been seeing well, throughout history, but also very much recently, where especially around George Floyd, when he was murdered, they had to have every narrative be, well, he was a loving father. It's just like, well, whether or not he was a father, he didn't deserve to die that way. He didn't deserve to die at all. But it just goes to show how American society is, where they're just like, well, in any other circumstances, he should have been killed, but because he was a father, I guess we should like feel bad about that. So I think that's part of the reason why police force just they do not care when it comes to like imposing violence upon Black bodies. And there's very much extensive proof that shows that white supremacists have infiltrated law enforcement throughout the country, throughout the past couple of decades and throughout history, because the police force is based on a system of slavery. So violence is very much so rationalized and accepted throughout this country. And there's so many narratives that support it, that people cannot see past it unless people give them a reason to, which I think is very, very bogus. But yeah, I definitely agree with Janae that the society we accept violence towards Black people because what else is there?
So I would also agree to what's already been stated. The initial response from law enforcement really highlights, as Janae said, like who is viewed as threatening and suspicious and who is not, right? We know that crime is racialized, such that Black and brown people, they are often viewed as threatening, as suspicious, and as criminals, while white individuals are not. So the idea that Black people are inherently dangerous and threatening is commonplace in America. But regarding the assault on the Capitol, we saw limited amounts of personnel deployed, and that only happened because an incident was not viewed as a credible threat, right? That can only happen when something is not viewed as a credible threat. So despite the fact that we know that there were repeated warnings from the FBI and other national security agencies, the Capitol Police were woefully underprepared to deal with the size of the crowd at the Capitol, to deal with the violence of the crowd at the Capitol. And some people I know were surprised to see law enforcement officials involved, in storming the Capitol or, placating the insurrectionists. But these concerns are really not new. Because as Selu just mentioned, we know that American policing is rooted in white supremacy. Many police departments originated as slave patrols that were dedicated to terrorizing and capturing enslaved people. And we know as a country, America has never truly dealt with the roots of law enforcement that links back to slave patrols. And so what we're seeing is that with the enormous power that police departments have, as well as access to weapons and access to sensitive information, we're seeing that police departments can and also have become quite attractive recruiting grounds for white supremacist groups.
Yeah, I would sort of definitely echo everything that's already been said. The only thing I would add is that, I think Jennifer is right? It wasn't thought of as a threat by people in power. And I would even go further and say that there was an interest among many people in power to have that cognitive distortion, to not view it as a threat, and then also to maybe know and intentionally explicitly think within their heads that maybe they are in support of the insurrectionists. I mean, we see many political leaders who did sort of explicitly support, and then others who are more complicit. Really, for them, if white supremacy means, overturning an election, keeping Trump in power, dividing the working class along racial lines, voter suppression, then I'm pretty sure they're all for it. They've been trying to do these things through quote unquote legal routes, and using sort of the failures of the situation could also be an excuse to allow them to continue to do these things. Oops, we didn't send enough officers. Oops, we were unprepared. Oops, we didn't know about this, even though actually the FBI has been talking about this for years. Reports have been published. Political leaders have been made aware of these reports with respect to the infiltration of various police departments with respect to white supremacists. Oath Keepers, the right-wing militia group has many police officers who are many people who are currently police officers in it, and then also former police officers. So this is not surprising, knowing what we know historically about slave patrols, also the way that police have been used against indigenous populations as well in the United States, in containing them and in pushing Native populations out from different sort of cities, and also the working class in the United States. So this is really what policing was set up to do. It's its function. And so the differential treatment really is not that much of a surprise.
Thank you. I think you did a wonderful job of sort of highlighting that the policing is working, right? It's not necessarily working as the majority of society would want it to intend, but it's working in terms of how the system was set up, what it was set up to do. It's problematic, and we're trying to change it. So it's about 3:45 right now, or 6:45, depending on where you are. And I know we have members of the audience who might like to ask questions. So I'll ask one more question. And then if you have any questions, could you please either use the raise hand function so we could call on you, or put it in the chat, and then we'll get to those questions after the panelists answer this question. Okay, so a number of you mentioned the connection between law enforcement and the Capitol rioters, right? So police departments could be sort of a breeding ground for white supremacy. And we know that at least 30 law enforcement officers from around the country actually participated in the Capitol insurrection, right? So we're getting more information about it all the time. The next question I have for you is a sort of thinking, moving forward. It's been about 30 years since Rodney King was beaten to death by 4 LAPD officers, right? We routinely hear about police use of force against communities of color. The panel mentioned that our current policing system is based on slave patrols. It's based on a history of slavery and oppression. If we think about the techniques that continued to be used in our communities, where do we go from here, right? We could think about various incidents where Black women, children, Black men were abused by the police, were killed by the police. What do you see as an important next step in this struggle to sort of end excessive use of force?
I think a really important next step for I think everyone in general is to recognize that these instances aren't isolated. They're not just random events that happen of just one cop was mad or like one situation was bad. It doesn't happen that often, but like you see it in the news every once in a while. It's something that happens every single day. And it's something that is so normalized that it gets brushed over that you don't even recognize it in your day-to-day lives. For instance, part of my activism over this past summer has been working with my partner, who is a special education teacher in the state of New York. She works primarily in the Bronx, and at their school, they work with primarily children of color and Black students with disabilities. And part of their COVID response for these schools was to, if a student doesn't wear a mask, they have to be isolated, and then the local police, the local precinct is called to take that child to the precinct to wait for the parent to come pick it up. And I haven't seen that policy implemented at any of the white schools that are in New York. They have a whole different policy for students that do not adapt to the COVID restrictions. And so that's an example of how children of color are treated differently than white students. And so I think it's very important that people look beyond just these incidences that end up in the newspaper and realize that this is something that it happens every day, and it happens more often than you would think. And to move beyond this, recognize it and find ways to call it out, and realize your own like implicit biases that you might have, and address them, and start addressing them within your community. Like if you have family members who have biases, talk to them about it and things like that. But I think just addressing it as a whole, and not just like, well, that's not something I would ever imagine would happen near me, and like seeing it as something like, this is how society is, and I should be actively trying to combat it versus thinking that it doesn't exist within my realm.
In terms of next steps in the struggle, for me, on one hand, I think that demands to hold individual officers that use excessive force accountable, can be very beneficial. It can be, presuming that any additional rules or requirements or guidelines that are imposed on departments are followed, right? Just yesterday, actually, for example, the governor in Illinois signed a House bill. I know it's called the Police and Criminal Justice Reform Bill. I forget the number of the House bill, but he signed it into law, and it includes many changes with regards to police, like new guidelines for decertification of police officers who are kind of repeat. I hate the term repeat offenders, but you know what I mean in this context. It bans police departments from purchasing military equipment, increases protections for whistleblowers and things like that, which, cool, yes. And, because it's a but and, I think at a time of mass mobilization and uprising, when communities are demanding reparation for historically rooted and ongoing harms from policing, I think it's a moment to dream big and fight for what I think are abolitionist demands, and a rejection of what an organization called Critical Resistance calls reformist reforms, which only further entrench our system of racist policing. I think non-reformist or abolitionist reforms, on the other hand, really work to chip away at policing and reduces overall impact. Like in the case of the 9-year-old girl in Rochester, who was pepper sprayed. we need to question why in the world police are responding to mental health crises in the first place, right? There's so many jobs that police do that they don't actually need to be doing, right? So, I know that defund the police has only recently elevated to mainstream discourse, but organizers have been fighting for this idea to defund the police and refund communities, or divest from police and invest in communities for quite some time now. Like the civil disobedience that I was talking about back in 2015, like that was our primary demand, like, so it's been a while, and I'm glad that it's now risen to the level of consciousness that, it's being debated on CNN, and, with all its criticisms, I don't want to debate the slogan itself, but the idea behind it, I'm 100% behind. By the way, the DC Capitol Police has a $460 million budget, right? So, I think defunding the police may sound completely ludicrous and off the rails to a lot of people who are like really wholly invested in this idea that police keeps us safe. But I think that belief in large part is due to just a lack of existing alternatives and a lack of imagination about what could be. So, spaces that I've been a part of that really engaged in some like visionary exercises to really imagine a world where police officers, police departments aren't the like primary arbiters of justice or the primary institution that we equate with public safety. Really just gives space to devise new understandings of what real safety looks like. And so, yeah, I think recent moves within this kind of defund, refund framework have been exciting for me to see. Post a lot of the actions that were happening over the summer, especially after George Floyd was killed, Minneapolis police schools severed ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. I think that was a critical win that people had been fighting for a long time, right? So yeah, I think that the fruits of that labor are just beginning, but there's so much more work to do. And I don't expect for everyone to necessarily agree with, or definitely not necessarily identify as an abolitionist per se, but if we could all just kind of like challenge ourselves to really go inward about how what are our views on what police's role is and what safety is and how they provide or do not provide that, and what are, like, as academics, as whatever field you're in, whether you're in public health or social work, like are there any ways that you're complicit in this police state that we live in? Are there ways that you can challenge that? Because I think that it is going to take everyone, if we're gonna shift this kind of institution that's been ingrained in the United States for literally generations, that kind of was born in the oppression of people who look like me. And so, yeah, that's going to take a lot of uprooting. And I think it has to go beyond just holding individual officers accountable for excessive use of force, and really also critique the institution itself. So I think it's a both and in terms of next steps.
So I am certainly, like Janae, all about defunding the police. Certainly, again, like she said too, we know that it's a controversial phrase, slogan, but when you think about divesting from a department where billions of dollars is spent on policing each year, 100 billion, and investing in marginalized communities, right? Investing in communities so that to help them thrive, like, that really is not controversial, right? That's really not controversial. And so, there's so many reasons why calls to defund the police are being made. And one is, typically when we hear of a tragic encounter of someone losing their life at the hands of the police. We go back, we sound like a broken record, the same old, right? Implicit bias training, cultural sensitivity training, more diverse police on the police force, de-escalation training. It's the same old, like the script is the same. It is the same, right? But the reality is we know that more than 1,000 men, women, and children die each year by the police. And we also know that thousands more, they are brutalized and abused. And Black people are the ones who undergo a wide range of harms, including being arrested, verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, and recipients of excessive use of force by the police. But also the reason why calls are being made to defund the police, to divest from the police department and invest in marginalized communities is because the vast majority of calls that police get are dealing with therefore lower level nonviolent activities in encounters that sometimes can escalate to deadly force. But these activities are often symptoms of underlying issues, for instance, of drug addiction, homelessness, mental illness. All of this should be treated by healthcare professionals and social workers rather than the police, rather than us expecting the police to be social workers and mental health clinicians, and at the same time want them to be police warriors, right? It's just, we want them to be all things to all people, like to be our saviors, and they are not. The other thing is so many people are under the impression that the police are pretty good at even solving violent crimes. The clearance rate for violent crimes, however, is quite abysmal. According to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, about 40% of homicides go unsolved every year. 66% of rapes go unsolved, 70% of robberies go unsolved, and nearly 50% of aggravated assaults go unsolved every single year. And police officers themselves, including some police chiefs, they will also acknowledge that they are often overworked, they are often overstressed, right? And that we look to them to solve every issue, from abuse, abandonment, homelessness, unemployment, school disruptions, domestic, like whatever it is, you name it, we rely on the police, and they say many will agree that they are not well equipped to deal with so many of these issues. And then again, last thing is $115 billion is spent on policing every single year, right? And so imagine if at the same time we have been seeing cuts to social service, we've been defunding, right? So I know we get all up in arms about defunding of the police, but we've been defunding social services, we've been defunding education, we've been defunding community resources for years, right? But there's something about, where we often there's this visceral reaction when we say defund the police, that they actually take up anywhere, depending on what city you're talking about, can comprise of 25 to more, 50% or more of the general funds within a major city. And so ultimately what we are seeing is that outsized spending increases on police, they're draining resources everywhere else. So I am all, like Janae, all for defunding the police, divesting from police, and investing in marginalized communities. And I would also agree with Janae as well, where it's important to provide reparations to survivors of police violence and their families, as well as to survivors of prison and detention and deportation violence and their families. So I'll stop there because I know I've taken up quite a bit of time.
So I see policing as part of a broader system, a carceral state or prison industrial complex. And so, I think sort of the solutions that we can take individually, but collectively as communities, really should be broader than policing. And we should understand how the courts justify and legitimate police practices, Fourth Amendment, what even constitutes reasonable search and seizure, and also how the courts themselves have their own forms of injustice, probation requirements and surveillance, and then how the courts funnel people into jails and prisons, and how bail procedures have people who are not convicted of a crime sitting in jail and then often pleading guilty. And so, I think, and so I've recently thought a lot through this with a colleague of mine, Amanda Woog, who's at the Texas Fair Defense Project and is doing amazing work on the ground. And we recently had a paper that's about to be forthcoming in California Law Review, where we're working alongside and thinking and theorizing alongside abolitionists on the ground post George Floyd, but then previously as well, and for decades, and the abolitionist work that's been happening for decades. And we've really sort of thought about three sort of ideas with respect to things that people can do and that people are already doing. And so one is power shifting. I think this is encapsulated in a lot of sort of what's already been talked about. But power shifting really is this idea that we need to shift power back to communities and away from legal authorities in the way that they characterize crime, but then also and their power to be able to pull people through the system. And so bail funds are a precise example of this, right? That's the community shifting power back into their hands to collectively determine who should be held pre-trial or not. Mutual aid organizations and things like that are also examples of power shifting. So is court watching, which happens on the ground. It happens in New York City. It happens where I am in the Bay Area, where people go into court and are spending time to physically be present in courthouses to be able to support their family, their communities, or strangers who they don't know, but they're there to show up, to be able to say, hey, I'm here to watch the people who are pulling the people in my community through the system. I'm here to make sure that the judges are not racist, that the prosecutors are not unfairly charging certain people. In addition to court watching, there's cop watching as well, right? And so that's sort of what we think of as power shifting. And then defund and reinvest, which has already been talked about a lot. So I won't say much on that. I think that is right. I think that is a wonderful path to abolition. And I think that that can happen not just with respect to policing, but also with respect to courts. Courts receive billions of dollars federally, and then each state receives, each state court system asks every year for a budget with respect to not only maintaining court buildings, but also being able to hire more prosecutors, being able to have more judges sit on criminal cases, not just in the civil caseload. And so thinking about defunding courts and court systems as well as a possibility toward abolition. And then the last is transformational practices. And I think this is sort of what we've been referring to as non-reformist reforms. This is, making sure that we do things on the way toward full abolition, such as electing progressive prosecutors, making sure that when they're elected, we hold them accountable to reducing the scale of the system rather than sort of just doing, what Jennifer was talking about, diversity training and things like that. We really need them to be committed to reducing the caseloads that they even take up and abolishing laws through their own discretionary choices, even if it's not done by the legislature, abolishing laws by deciding not to charge people for certain offenses. So yeah, I could talk all day for this, as I'm sure all of us could. So yeah, let's open it up to questions, I suppose.
Thank you so much. So the first question is from Eileen Painter Kim. And Eileen writes, after 45's acquittal, how would you define the difference between the contemporary Republican Party as a whole and the far right?
I'm not sure I have a great answer for this, but at least the way I think about it, kind of similar to how I think about the Democratic Party, really. I mean, I think there are people who vote Democrat, right, that are super far left of anybody who's in the Democratic Party, right? Right, but there are factions in the Democratic Party, just like there are factions in the Republican Party. So I think that, big picture, what party aligns the most with your core ideas and values is, kind of where you fall. But that doesn't, the Republican Party is not monolithic, just like the Democratic Party isn't. So I think, at least the way I think about it, the far right, if they had to choose between one of two in this two-party system, yeah, they probably fit there, but they're not all the same. Yeah, that's not really a robust answer to that question, but yeah, that's how I think about it.
For that, I would argue if there even is an actual difference between the Republican Party and the far right, because they're both systems that are basically based within the same racist foundation, and they have allowed these systems of oppression to exist to this point in time. One is a little bit more extreme than the other, but one gets to hide behind politics and democracy, and the other gets a lot of backlash by being like, well, you're American rebels. But I think that they are actually one and the same, especially after what has happened in recent events with the acquittal and everything in America right now. So I can't really see the difference.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I personally just see it as like kind of like what Janae was saying too, that there's factions in both party. I think it is problematic if we see them as, they're not a monolithic, right? So I think it is problematic if we group everyone one and the same, because that's not how I see it. But I don't have much more to add other than what has already been stated.
I also don't have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. So the second question is coming from Cayman Forbes, and the question is, Ron DeSantis is working on a bill that makes the punishment of destruction of property via protesting harsher and more serious. Some have called it an anti-protest bill. How do you think this kind of legislation would impact the progress made or people's passion for protesting for justice?
My first mind is that such legislation, it's easy to frame it or situate it in direct response to what happened at the Capitol. In a large part, it may wholly be, but just thinking forward in terms of the potential impact on the other side of those protests, just thinking about the BLM movement, I think they could be very well another thing that ends up being used against us or being used to criminalize us. I think about one of the reasons why I try to refrain from talking about what happened at the Capitol as domestic terrorism, even though it was. I think about how the many ways in which the state has referred to Black activists as Black identity extremists and like kind of groups, folks fighting within this contemporary Black freedom movement as domestic terrorists as well, and that being weaponized or used against groups. And so I am really weary about the potential successes of and impact of such anti-protest bills beyond these far right white supremacists, and how that might impact protesting within the Black Lives Matter movement as well.
I think that this bill would detrimentally harm people of color and Black protesters in particular. It's kind of similar to other bills that have been passed, such as the walking while trans ban here in New York City, where it gives law enforcement the right to stop and frisk anyone that they suspect to be soliciting prostitution based upon their appearance, but it disproportionately targets people of color and Black trans women. And based on my own experiences with protesting and throughout history, people of color in protests tend to be targeted more. And so this bill would be passed just to basically give them more right and more of like a backbone to come and question and target Black and POC protesters versus white protesters, because I do believe somebody walked out with a pedestal on camera at the Capitol riot, but nobody said anything about that. But Target was a huge thing in the news at some point. So I just feel like this is a great example of racist legislation that's being pushed to further a racist agenda and target people of color in American society.
Yeah, I think anytime a legislation policy is passed, I think we always need to be aware of the impact it can have on marginalized individuals, because we all know a ton of policies and practices and laws that have been passed that ultimately appear to look, one way, colorblind, neutral at face value, but then ultimately have a disparate impact on Black and Brown people. So I think we always need, I'm always, as much as I will push certain, that we need to make certain policy changes at the federal, state, and even local level, I am always still leery about like how that could potentially unintended or intended impact, Black and Brown people. So I think that always needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, this just expands the criminal code in a way that the criminal code prosecutors already have the ability to charge people with respect to this, and they're already doing it. And we saw this throughout the BLM protests. So, I think one part of the question asks about sort of people's passion for protesting justice, and how the bill might affect sort of as like a signal or something, right? Sort of the idea that, oh no, you really need to think carefully about whether you should go out and protest. I think, really, I think Janae may, and maybe Selu said this earlier, I think when people go out to protest, especially if you're Black or a person of color, if you're Indigenous, you already know what sort of the threat is and the potential for you to be pulled into the system unfairly. And so, I don't know whether this would actually have a signal effect on reducing protests, but that is something that, I'd be worried about, but I'm not sure. Empirically, I wonder if it really would. I think people are already sort of locked in that this is risky, but this is something that I'm doing because there's a broader just purpose that I'm, passionate about. And so hopefully this wouldn't have that effect, and hopefully the bill just doesn't get passed.
Well, as you're talking, Matthew, I'm also thinking about how we still saw, in the aftermath of, we still saw thousands of people, in the midst of COVID-19, right? A pandemic, right? We have seen so many people take to the streets, despite knowing the risks involved, despite this dual pandemic, right? Of COVID-19 on the one hand and systemic racism and police violence on the other hand, right? So I think this can be an attempt to try to deter protesters, but I feel like we have seen that those who are committed to the cause will not be deterred, right? Because quite aware of the attempt to suppress the voice, right? I feel like we're seeing this in a way that we've never seen this before. And we know that the Black Lives Matters movement is now the largest civil rights movement that in American history. So I don't know if I feel like we are at a point in time where an attempt to put out this, anti-police protest. I don't think that's going to happen. I feel like there's so much mobilization that has taken place, and people acutely aware of attempts to suppress the protests of Black and Brown people. So I'm not quite sure if it will completely deter those who are already committed to the cause.
Thank you so much. So the next question is coming from Bailey Brower. And the question is, what is a way that you would see appropriate for someone with white privilege to support the Black community? And is there a point where you could see someone who doesn't share your experience of being a part of the Black community as overstepping with their supports?
That's a very great question, and something that I have very recently been experiencing, especially with organizing in New York. A lot of the organizations up here have white leadership, and I believe the one way in which a lot of white or non-Black people tend to overstep is when they believe that their role is essential to your liberation. Something that I have said in the past where I have spoken at other rallies or protests is that we're not asking for a seat at the table. We already have a key to the front door, because the only people who are responsible for Black liberation is Black people. You cannot you cannot you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, basically. And so I think that's when a lot of people kind of overstep, where they think that they are essential to your own liberation, kind of like the white savior complex. I think when they lead chants, or when they have suggestions for how you can overcome oppression, I think that kind of oversteps. But overall, like, basically speaking over or silencing Black and brown voices when we are giving you the step-by-step on what like we want and how we want to get it, and they're just like, well, I see another route for you. I think that's a big thing that I've seen, especially over this past summer, where a lot of white liberals kind of got involved in activism, where they were kind of taking the microphone away from Black speakers who were just like, I've been fighting for this for my entire life, and you're coming in telling me how I need to, fight for my own liberation. So I think listening to the communities that are around you, listening to the people who are being oppressed, and following our direction is the best way to support Black and brown communities, because we've been in this fight forever, and we know what we want. We're not asking anymore, but we need your support behind us, not taking us by the hand and walking us through the door, basically.
I totally agree with that. I'd echo everything that Selu said. I would just add, in terms of ways to, what was it, like someone with white privilege to support the Black community. So one thing I'm thinking about right now, and like the first thing that came to my head was, so I'm a part of this collective of faculty and grad students at UIC called the Policing in Chicago Research Group, that kind of works with social movement organizations, like provides like research support to movement organizations in Chicago, that has campaigns going around policing. And the coordinator of this group is a white male tenured professor named Andrew Clarno. And in this one campaign in particular around ending Chicago police's use of a gang database, wherein over like 80% of the people in this database are Black. Organizations wanted to know the mechanics behind the database, how many people are in it, how is it being used, how long do you stay in, just all of these unanswered questions that we can't just Google or just like walk up in the police department and ask. So Andy, being the white man that he is, who's a researcher at this university, like literally set up interviews with current and former police officers and higher ups in the Chicago Police Department to get answers to his question. Literally all he had to do was set up these meetings. I couldn't set up those meetings, right? So like that was like one concrete way that he's like literally able to use his white privilege to be a co-conspirator of sorts in gaining information that we were ultimately able to use in informing campaign strategy for that particular campaign. I'd say more broadly than that, I think that particularly grassroots organizations that are kind of succumb to the nonprofit industrial complex, if they even do have nonprofit status. Money is a thing. I think donations are always welcome. I think if you have access to things like space to for folks to meet, or space to hold an event or something like that. I've been a part of like different types of skill trainings wearing their trainers were white, and then like I legit learned a lot, and like or played roles that would be more harmful for more marginalized folks, like a police liaison in the context of an action. Or there are ways, but I think the key at the end of the day is what Selu said, which is to follow a lead, just to kind of just keep your role in mind of that you're supporting these movements, not leading them. So listen to the experts of the folks' own experience in how you lend that support.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree about the need to listen and to lift up the voices of those who are directly impacted by police violence. So Black and Brown people. There's so many ways for one to use their privilege, right? And so, follow and get involved with Black Lives Matter chapters or other local Black-led organizations. And find out about the proposed policies that they've already came up with, right? And funding changes that can be done within your city. And then as Janae mentioned, donate. You can sign up for updates, you can volunteer and take action when asked, right? I think then it's also once it's clear, what these activists have come up with in terms of policy changes, then go ahead and take additional action and contact your city, your town government rep and police chief to then advocate for these policies. And so I think those are just some of the ways that one can continue to use their privilege and serve as an ally for activists.
Yeah, I agree with all of these ideas. And one thing that I would highlight, though, is for anyone who is white and has white privilege, is to also be aware of and wary of really Black heterogeneity. And so by that, I mean, not everyone in the Black community has experienced police violence. Not everyone is exceedingly marginalized and living in a disadvantaged community that's constantly surveilled by police. And so there are Black people who are elite. And you have a orientation or a part of a social position or within a social position where potentially, they may have interest in maintaining the status quo, in maintaining racial capitalism even, they may not, and their individual lives, in everyday interactions benefit from white supremacy, but maybe, their employment position or whatever might benefit from forms of capitalism that Black people who are multiply marginalized ultimately want to dismantle, and also sort of have a democratic interest in building a democratic United States that incorporates them in a way that some Black elites are not ready for. And so I would just say, don't just listen to Black people and all Black people, but really also be critical about which Black people you're listening to and the positions that they come from, because it's often the case that sometimes Black people in positions of power, the reason why they're in a position of power is because they are not as marginalized as other Black people. And so really pulling back and saying, okay, who's not as vocal or whose voice hasn't really been heard, and really making sure to understand that democracy means not just including, the leaders of each group, but really making sure that we're listening to those who are most marginalized, whose voices are less often heard as we move toward progress for our society.
Thank you so much to our panelists. So I'm looking at the time, and I believe we have time for just one more question. So just based on the order that the questions came in, the last question would be from Lauren. And Lauren's question is, do you think that due to today's increasingly tense social climate, do you already see or predict to see an increase in social workers / mental health practitioners? If so, what impacts do you predict you will see or hope to see?
I don't already necessarily see an increase in social workers or mental health practitioners. I do hope that will be the case, especially as I know there are several campaigns, several existing campaigns right now, kind of in the same vein of the idea of defund that are calling for, counselors in schools instead of cops, or, just even in earlier when we were talking about the 9-year-old girl who was pepper sprayed, and just the idea of like why police are responding to mental health crises in the first place. I hope that these really critical conversations that we're having about policing kind of opens the mental space to think about how more social workers and mental health practitioners and just public health experts, et cetera, can kind of feel some of the space that police have been taking up or are tasked to take up, when they really shouldn't. So yeah, I mean, I would, it's my hope that we see an increase in social workers, and with that increase, I hope that we can be critical just around our collaborations with law enforcement and just really think critically about the ways that we not make people whole, but really preserve people's dignity, especially those who tend to live their lives on the margins of society, in ways that they've been historically undermined by the existing carceral systems that we kind of operate within now.
I definitely think that if we are pushing for a future where there is going to be abolition and defunding of the police, that there will be an increase in social workers and mental health practitioners. I am not sure how that will actually play out depending on who is implementing it, but I would hope that people would be mindful and wary of how the structure of social workers work within the United States, because they are coming from a person, as I am, like an Indigenous and Black person. Social workers in our communities are often the next level of the police, where they are called on people who are marginalized. Going back to my partner who works in the South Bronx, a lot of her students are children of color, and a lot of them are undocumented. And if there's ever an instance where people are questioning like the parents in any way, social workers are immediately called and the children are removed based on very little evidence of any wrongdoing, just strictly on, well, I have to figure it out because there is a moment of discrimination. So I would hope that social workers would be semi-reformed if they are going to be implemented more so than the police. It's not a perfect system, as none of these systems are, but if they are going to implement them more, then I think that they should understand the role that they play in communities of color and the space that they take up and how communities of color can benefit from it. So I think that's something to be mindful of.
So I think the only thing I would just like to add as well, I also would hope to see more social workers and mental health clinicians. I think what we might see as a way to try to maybe placate activists is, I feel like we're seeing this now. So increasing maybe social workers within the police department, right? Like I see that's happened. Like even at my institution, and right. So as if hiring this one additional social worker or mental health clinician, this is going to help, and it's usually just one or two. So I think we may see more if there is going to be an increase in that. I think we're going to see an attempt to do that within the police department. I think what would need to happen if there is an actual increase in social workers and mental health clinicians outside of the police department, certainly then, everyone's concerned, safety, what happens to crime rates and violent rates. So certainly evaluation studies in terms of what happens with crime rates when there is an increase of social workers and mental health clinicians addressing so many of these mental health issues that are taking place.
Thank you so much to our panel for such an invigorating discussion. Thank you to the people who joined us today and asked questions and who listened on and took notes. I'd just like to end by thanking the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Chicago for co-sponsoring this event. Special thanks to Dean Hairston and Dr. Henrika McCoy, and also the Division on People of Color and Crime of the American Society of Criminology, who also co-sponsored this event.